The classroom buzzed with whispers as Ms. Carter, the stern math teacher, glared at the boy who sat awkwardly at his desk. "Late again, Daniel," she barked, his voice echoing through the room. "And what's your excuse this time? Does your father think punctuality isn't important?" The student snickered. "Or is he too busy slacking off to teach you any discipline?" Little did Ms. Carter know, the man he just mocked wasn't just Daniel's father. He was a decorated war hero, known for courage beyond comprehension. Daniel Gray avoided attention. At 13, he already knew what it felt like to be the target of cruel jokes and dismissive looks. Small for his age and unassuming, he was overshadowed by louder, more confident students. His quiet nature wasn't a lack of intelligence. It was a defense against a world that seemed too harsh. At home, Daniel's father, Major Samuel Gray, was the opposite. Tall, broad-shouldered, and calm, Samuel rarely spoke of his military past. His medals and certificates lay forgotten in a box in the attic. For Samuel, the past was closed, and his focus was on the present. He wanted Daniel to grow without the weight of his legacy. But school was a battlefield of its own. Each morning, Daniel dreaded the classroom. His classmates, quick to judge, saw him as an easy target. Their jabs weren't physical, but verbal, whispered comments and muffled laughter that cut just as deep. His attempts to participate were often ignored. Ms. Carter, the math teacher, made things worse. Known for his sharp tongue, he had little patience for students who didn't meet his standards. Unfortunately, Daniel often bore the brunt of Carter's ire. Late homework or hesitant answers fueled his scorn. "Gray, do you plan to spend the year daydreaming? Or will you contribute?" Ms. Carter sneered one day. The class erupted in laughter, and Daniel felt his face flush. He tried to focus, but his trembling hands blurred the numbers on the board. At home, Daniel found some solace in his father's presence. Samuel noticed his son's unhappiness. "What's on your mind, Danny?" he'd ask during their evening walks. But Daniel shrugged, unwilling to share his burden. What Daniel didn't know was that Samuel saw everything: the slumped shoulders, the forced smiles, the quiet sighs. A decorated war hero, Samuel had faced countless challenges, but his son's silent suffering was a pain he struggled to confront. One day, after a particularly difficult day, Daniel sat at the kitchen table staring at untouched homework. Samuel joined him, his tone calm but firm. "You know, Danny, the hardest battles are the ones inside us. But you're stronger than you think." Daniel didn't respond, but those words stayed with him. That night he wondered what battles his father had faced to become the man he was. For the first time, he felt a flicker of hope. The next morning, Daniel tried to approach the day differently. He met his classmates' eyes, even briefly. He raised his hand in math class, though his voice wavered. And though Ms. Carter remained unimpressed, Daniel felt a spark of pride. The whispers and laughter continued, and Ms. Carter's remarks stung, but Daniel clung to his father's words. He didn't know how much longer he could endure, but for now, he held on to hope. Change was coming, starting with the man he admired most: his father. The sun hung low in the sky as Daniel dragged his feet toward the school gates. Another sleepless night had left him groggy and behind schedule. His father's words had given him some strength, but the unrelenting pressure of school quickly chipped away at his resolve. Today, however, would be different, not for reasons Daniel could control, but for the moment that awaited him in Miss Carter's classroom. The bell rang, signaling the start of math class. Daniel slipped into his seat, clutching his late homework assignment. His breath hitched as Miss Carter's voice thundered. "Late again, Gray?" The teacher's sharp tone silenced the room. Daniel nodded, avoiding the accusing stares of his peers. Miss Carter walked to Daniel's desk, towering over him. "And what's the excuse this time? Did your father forget to teach you responsibility?" His words dripped with condescension. The class erupted into laughter. Daniel's cheeks burned as he tried to sink into his chair. He wished he could disappear. Do you think life will reward your laziness, Gray? Miss Carter continued, ignoring Daniel's discomfort. Let me guess. Your father's too busy lounging around to teach you how to follow basic rules. The laughter grew louder, but this time Daniel felt something snap within him. He opened his mouth to defend his father, but the words caught in his throat. What no one in the room knew, including Miss Carter, was the truth about Daniel's father. Major Samuel Gray wasn't just any man. He was a decorated war hero who had led countless soldiers through perilous missions. His medals weren't just trinkets. They were symbols of bravery, sacrifice, and unwavering discipline. But Samuel had chosen humility over fame, keeping his accomplishments hidden even from Daniel's teachers. As the laughter subsided, Daniel remained silent, his fists clenched under the desk. He could hear the whispers around him, feel the weight of their judgment. Ms. Carter smirked, satisfied with his performance, and turned back to the board. But Daniel's mind raced, his emotions a whirlwind of shame, anger, and confusion. When the class ended, Daniel stayed behind, determined to confront Ms. Carter. He stood by the teacher's desk, his voice trembling. "You don't know anything about my father," he said, barely above a whisper. Ms. Carter glanced at him, unimpressed. "If you want respect, Gray, you need to earn it. Now run along before you're late for your next class." Daniel walked out, defeated but resolved. That evening, he told his father everything. Samuel listened quietly, his expression unreadable. When Daniel finished, tears threatening to spill, Samuel placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "You did the right thing by standing up for me," he said. "But this isn't over." The next morning, Samuel accompanied Daniel to school. He wore no medals, no uniform, just his usual quiet confidence. As they entered the school building, Daniel felt a flicker of hope. His father had faced enemies far greater than a cruel teacher, and now he was here to face this battle for Daniel. What happened next would change everything, not just for Daniel, but for Ms. Carter and the entire class. The air in the hallway felt heavy as Daniel walked beside his father. Samuel Gray moved with quiet confidence, his presence commanding attention. Students whispered as they passed, glancing at the man who seemed to radiate authority. Miss Carter's classroom door was slightly ajar when they reached it. Samuel knocked firmly before stepping inside. The students fell silent at the sight of him, their chatter vanishing. Miss Carter looked up from his desk, his expression shifting from irritation to surprise. "And you are?" he asked. "I'm Samuel Gray," he said simply. His calm voice carried weight. "Daniel's father. We need to talk." Miss Carter raised an eyebrow, glancing at Daniel. "If this is about his performance, I assure you I've tried to encourage him. He needs discipline." Samuel cut him off, his tone steady. "With respect, I'm here about how you've treated my son. I find your approach unacceptable." The class sat frozen. Miss Carter straightened, clearly defensive. "Mr. Gray, I'm a teacher. My job is to prepare these kids for the real world. If my methods seem harsh, maybe you should reconsider what you're teaching your son." Samuel stepped closer, his voice low but firm. "I've faced more real-world challenges than you could imagine," he said. "But I learned leadership isn't about tearing others down. It's about building them up." Miss Carter blinked, momentarily caught off guard. Samuel continued, his tone unwavering. "You belittle my son, and, in doing so, insult the values I've spent my life defending. You assume the worst about me and him without knowing who we are or what we've overcome." The silence in the room was absolute. Daniel's heart raced as he watched his father's composed yet powerful stance. The students stared, their usual smirks replaced with awe. Samuel addressed the class. "Respect isn't about being in charge or speaking the loudest. It's about seeing the worth in others, even when they're struggling, especially then." Turning back to Ms. Carter, he added, "Your responsibility isn't just to teach equations, but to model integrity." For the first time, Miss Carter faltered. His eyes darted to the students, then back to Samuel. "I may have been too harsh," he admitted reluctantly, "but my intention is to prepare them for life's challenges." Samuel nodded. "Then teach strength without cruelty. Show accountability without humiliation. The lessons you leave will shape the adults they become." The bell rang, breaking the tension. Samuel turned to Daniel, placing a steady hand on his shoulder. "Let's go, son." As they walked out, Daniel felt a mix of pride, relief, and awe. Back in the classroom, Miss Carter stood motionless, staring after them. The murmurs of students grew louder as they filed out. For the first time, he wondered if he had been wrong, not just about Daniel, but himself. The school day had ended, but the events in Miss Carter's classroom lingered. Daniel couldn't forget his father's calm authority. For the first time, he saw Samuel not just as a parent but as someone whose strength could silence a room. Yet it left Daniel with questions about who his father truly was. That evening, Daniel sat at the kitchen table, his math homework forgotten. Samuel entered with 2 cups of tea, taking a seat across from him. "You've been quiet," Samuel said, studying his son. "What's on your mind?" Daniel hesitated. "Today, with Miss Carter, I didn't know you could be like that. You seemed unstoppable." Samuel smiled faintly. "Sometimes people need reminding that strength isn't about power. It's about doing what's right, even when it's hard." Daniel twirled his pencil, his curiosity growing. "Why don't you talk about your time in the military? Everyone says how amazing you were, but you never mention it." Samuel's expression softened. "Because what I did back then doesn't define me now. The past is important, but it's not the whole story. What matters most is being your father and teaching you to stand tall." Daniel absorbed his father's words but pressed further. "Were you ever scared?" "Of course," Samuel replied. "Bravery isn't the absence of fear. It's acting despite it. But the hardest battles weren't on the battlefield. They came afterward. Now, my most important fight is making sure you know you're never alone." The conversation lingered in Daniel's mind as he lay in bed. For the first time, he began to understand his father's quiet strength and the values he lived by. The next day at school, the atmosphere had shifted. Whispers of the confrontation had spread. Students who once teased Daniel now watched him with a mix of curiosity and respect. Even Ms. Carter seemed subdued, his sharp remarks replaced by a quieter demeanor. At the start of math class, Ms. Carter cleared his throat. "Before we begin, I want to say something," he announced, his tone uncharacteristically serious. The class fell silent. "Yesterday, I was reminded that it's easy to judge others when you don't know their story, but everyone deserves respect." His eyes briefly met Daniel's before he turned to the board. Though his words were brief, they carried weight. For the first time, Daniel felt something shift, not just in how others saw him, but in how he saw himself. After class, a few students approached Daniel. "Your dad's awesome," one said, their tone sincere. Another added, "I didn't know he was a war hero." Daniel didn't know how to respond. For years, he'd been mocked and dismissed, and now, acceptance felt strange. That evening, Daniel shared the day's events with his father. Samuel listened with a quiet smile. "Respect is earned, Danny," he said, "not by demanding it, but by living in a way that others can't ignore." Daniel nodded, pride swelling in his chest. For the first time, he felt steady, grounded by his father's unwavering support and wisdom. The whispers about Samuel Gray didn't fade. By the next week, the entire school knew about the mysterious war hero who had confronted Ms. Carter. Daniel noticed the change. Some students treated him with respect, while others cautiously asked about his father. But despite this, unease lingered. Ms. Carter had been quieter, but his wounded pride was palpable. Though he had indirectly apologized to the class, tension simmered beneath the surface, particularly when it came to Daniel. That tension erupted one Monday morning. Daniel, seated on time with completed homework, thought the day would pass uneventfully. But mid-lesson, Ms. Carter's sharp tone returned. "Gray, if you're done daydreaming, explain this equation," he barked. The room fell silent. Daniel stood, his stomach twisting, and began solving the problem on the board. His voice wavered under Ms. Carter's glare, and he stumbled over his explanation. "That's incorrect," Ms. Carter said flatly. "Sit down." The humiliation was immediate. A few students stifled laughter, and Daniel sank into his seat, cheeks burning. After class, Ms. Carter stopped him. "Your father's reputation doesn't change anything, Gray," he said. "If you want respect, earn it yourself." The words cut deep. At home that evening, Daniel vented his frustration. "Why did you even come to school, Dad? It feels worse now." Samuel listened, his voice calm. "Change takes time, Danny. Standing up for what's right doesn't fix everything immediately, but it matters." "What if it doesn't work?" Daniel asked, his voice tinged with defeat. "Then we keep going," Samuel said firmly. "Respect isn't about being liked, it's about staying true to yourself." The next day, Samuel returned to the school unannounced. He waited until Ms. Carter's class ended and approached him in the hallway. The teacher stiffened but held his ground. "I wanted to thank you," Samuel began, his tone even, "for challenging my son. He needs to grow, but he also needs fairness. If you see something lacking, guide him. Don't tear him down." Ms. Carter blinked, clearly surprised. "I assumed you came to argue." "I'm here to remind you of your responsibility," Samuel replied. "Treat my son, and all your students, with the respect you demand from them." For a moment, Ms. Carter was silent. Then he nodded. "I'll think about that," he said, his tone carrying a hint of sincerity. As Samuel left the school, Daniel felt a shift. The tension wasn't gone, but there was now room for change. In the weeks that followed, Ms. Carter's demeanor softened. His high expectations remained, but the harshness began to fade. For Daniel, the respect he gained, from others and himself, became a foundation for something greater. Weeks passed, and the tension between Ms. Carter and Daniel gradually faded. Though the teacher remained demanding, his approach softened, and the biting remarks that had once defined him grew less frequent. Daniel, for the first time in years, began to feel a sense of belonging. The other students, too, seemed to change. Some had started to show genuine interest in Daniel, asking him about his father's past or even inviting him to sit with them at lunch. While Daniel still felt awkward with the newfound attention, he couldn't deny that the respect felt good. It was strange, though, how quickly the dynamics had shifted. He went from being invisible to being someone worth noticing, and that adjustment was just as challenging as the ridicule had been. One day, during math class, Ms. Carter surprised everyone. "Today, we're putting aside the textbooks," he announced, leaning against his desk. The students exchanged confused glances. "We're going to talk about failure." The room grew quiet as Ms. Carter continued. "When I was younger, I wanted to be an engineer. I worked hard, but when I finally made it to university, I struggled. I wasn't the smartest, and for the first time, I failed. Repeatedly." He paused, his gaze distant. "That failure broke me, and for a long time I blamed everyone but myself. It wasn't until I became a teacher that I realized failure isn't the end. It's a lesson." The students listened intently, many seeing their teacher in a new light. Ms. Carter turned to Daniel. "I've been hard on you, Gray. Too hard, maybe. But I see potential in you, and I want you to know that it's okay to stumble. What matters is getting back up." Daniel's throat tightened, but he managed a small nod. For the first time, he saw Ms. Carter not as an adversary, but as someone who was, in his own way, trying to help. He still carried some resentment, but the moment felt genuine, and that was enough for now. Later that day, Daniel found himself walking home with a small group of classmates. "Your dad's a legend," one of them said, grinning. "Ms. Carter's actually acting human now. It's weird." The group laughed, and Daniel joined in, the sound unfamiliar but welcome. At home, Daniel recounted the day to his father, who listened with quiet pride. "Sounds like Miss Carter's learning his own lessons," Samuel said. "Sometimes, the hardest part of being strong is admitting you were wrong." Daniel thought about that long after the conversation ended. It wasn't just Miss Carter who was changing. He was too. He realized that respect, both given and earned, wasn't about grand gestures. It was about the small, everyday choices to be better. That evening, as Daniel sat at his desk, he opened his math textbook with a new sense of determination. For the first time, he wasn't just working to avoid criticism. He wanted to prove to himself that he could succeed. The next morning, Miss Carter handed back graded assignments. Daniel's heart pounded as he flipped his paper over. An A. He stared at the grade in disbelief. Miss Carter caught his eye and gave a small, approving nod. It wasn't just a grade. It was a sign that things were changing, for both of them. Daniel's confidence continued to grow, fueled by his newfound respect for himself and the softened dynamic with Miss Carter. Yet one question lingered. Who was his father beyond the quiet, humble man he saw at home? Samuel Gray had always avoided speaking about his past. The stories others shared, tales of heroism and bravery, were left unconfirmed by Samuel himself. That changed when the school announced a Veterans Day assembly. The principal invited local heroes to share their experiences, and Daniel immediately thought of his father. That evening, Daniel broached the subject hesitantly. "Dad, the school is hosting a Veterans Day assembly. They want veterans to speak. Someone like you." Samuel's expression grew thoughtful. "I appreciate the thought, Danny, but I don't do these things for recognition. The past is behind me." "But what if your story could help people?" Daniel pressed. "What if it could show them what real strength looks like?" Samuel studied his son for a moment before sighing. "I'll think about it." To Daniel's surprise, Samuel agreed. On the morning of the assembly, Daniel watched from the audience, nervous but excited. Samuel stood out among the other veterans who wore their medals and uniforms proudly. Dressed simply, with no outward signs of his military achievements, Samuel looked out of place, and yet completely himself. When it was his turn to speak, Samuel stepped up to the podium. The room fell silent as his calm voice filled the space. "Good morning. My name is Samuel Gray, and I served as a major in the armed forces. But I'm not here to talk about medals or battles. I'm here to share what those experiences taught me about life." He paused, his gaze steady. Courage isn't about never feeling fear. It's about moving forward despite it. Leadership isn't about giving orders. It's about earning trust. And strength is about lifting others up, not pushing them down. As Samuel spoke, the room hung on his every word. For Daniel, it was a moment of pride unlike anything he'd ever felt. The father he knew, a man of quiet humility, was revealing the depth of his wisdom to an audience that included Miss Carter and all his classmates. When Samuel finished, thunderous applause filled the room. Students and teachers lined up to shake his hand. Among them was Miss Carter, who seemed almost shy as he approached. "Mr. Gray," he began, his voice uncharacteristically soft, "your words, they were powerful. Thank you." Samuel nodded graciously. "Thank you for listening." On their way home, Daniel turned to his father. "I think I understand now why you don't talk about the past. It's not about hiding. It's about focusing on what really matters." Samuel smiled, a quiet pride shining through. "Exactly, Danny. The past shapes us, but it's what we do in the present that defines us." For Daniel, the day wasn't just about his father's legacy. It was about discovering his own strength and the values he wanted to carry forward. The Veterans Day Assembly left a lasting impression. but for Ms. Carter it ignited a deeper reckoning. As he watched Samuel Gray humbly accept admiration, guilt weighed on him. He had judged Daniel harshly, assuming weakness where there was quiet strength. Samuel's words about leadership and lifting others up echoed in his mind, forcing Ms. Carter to confront his own flaws. In the quiet of an empty classroom, Ms. Carter stared at his gradebook. Daniel's name was circled in red from an earlier assignment, graded with unnecessary severity. With a sigh, he reached for a blank sheet of paper and began to write. The next morning, Daniel found a folded note on his desk. Hesitant, he glanced at Ms. Carter, who avoided his gaze. Curious, Daniel opened the note. "Daniel, I owe you an apology. I've been unfair and underestimated you. Your father's words reminded me of the teacher I want to be, someone who builds, not breaks. Thank you for your patience with me. I'll do better. Ms. Carter." Daniel read the note twice, his chest tightening with surprise and relief. Folding it carefully, he slipped it into his notebook, unsure of how to respond. For the first time, he saw Ms. Carter as someone capable of change. Over the next weeks, the difference in Ms. Carter's approach was clear. While still demanding, his criticism turned constructive, and he began offering genuine encouragement. For Daniel, the transformation was profound. He no longer dreaded math class. Instead, he felt a quiet determination to succeed. His classmates noticed, too, remarking how Ms. Carter seemed less harsh, even to them. One afternoon, after class, Ms. Carter stopped Daniel. "You've been doing good work," he said, his tone uncharacteristically warm. "Keep it up." "Thank you, sir," Daniel replied, his voice steady. "And thank you for the note." Ms. Carter gave a small nod. "Sometimes students teach us as much as we teach them." His words lingered, a rare moment of vulnerability from the once intimidating teacher. At home, Daniel shared the note with his father. Samuel read it carefully, a small smile tugging at his lips. "It takes strength to admit when you're wrong," he said. "Sounds like Ms. Carter is finding his own courage." "Do you think people can really change?" Daniel asked, his voice filled with curiosity. Samuel's gaze was steady. "Absolutely. Change isn't easy, but everyone has the potential to grow, even teachers." That night, as Daniel lay in bed, he reflected on the past few weeks. He had gained respect from his peers and Ms. Carter, but more importantly, he had begun to respect himself. The lessons from his father and the experiences in school had taught him something invaluable. For Daniel, this was the greatest lesson, not one found in textbooks, but earned through experience. Respect is built on understanding, and true strength lies in the willingness to grow. As the weeks passed, Samuel Gray's words from the Veterans Day Assembly continued to resonate. The classroom, once filled with tension and competition, began to change. Students who had been adversaries became allies, and a new sense of respect and cooperation emerged. Daniel, who had spent years trying to remain unseen, began to step forward. He raised his hand in math class, not always sure of the answer, but unafraid to try. His courage inspired others to take risks, turning mistakes into learning moments rather than reasons for ridicule. One afternoon, Ms. Carter assigned a group project that required collaboration to solve complex problems. In the past, such assignments would have led to frustration and blame-shifting, but this time, something was different. Daniel's group included classmates who had once teased him, yet they approached the task with focus and teamwork. "Daniel, you're good at this," one of them said, sliding their notebook toward him. The casual acknowledgement felt monumental. Daniel leaned in, explaining the problem step by step. For the first time, he felt like an equal among his peers. The class's energy shifted during the project. Laughter replaced tension, and students who rarely spoke began helping one another. Even Ms. Carter seemed more relaxed, offering encouragement instead of criticism as he moved between groups. There was a newfound sense of camaraderie in the classroom, one that had never existed before. At home, Daniel shared the experience with his father. "Even the kids who used to tease me are nice," he said, amazed. "We're actually working together." Samuel nodded. "Respect is contagious," he said. "Once it takes root, it changes everything. But it started with you, Danny. You showed them what courage looks like." The group project ended with a surprising result. Nearly every group excelled. Ms. Carter addressed the class, his voice carrying an uncharacteristic warmth. "You've shown me something I didn't expect," he said. "When you work together, you're capable of more than you realize. Well done." The class erupted into applause, celebrating not just their grades, but the effort that had brought them there. For Daniel, it was a moment of pride, not just in himself, but in the group as a whole. He glanced around at his classmates, seeing smiles where once there had been smirks, and felt a sense of belonging he had never known. As the school day ended, Miss Carter stopped Daniel before he left. "You've come a long way, Gray," he said, his tone sincere. "You're proving yourself and helping others do the same." "Thank you, sir," Daniel replied, sincerity in his voice. "I've had good examples." Walking home, Daniel felt lighter than he had in years. He thought about how far he'd come, from being a target of ridicule to finding his place as a quiet leader. He knew challenges would continue, but for the first time, he felt ready to face them. The school year was nearing its end, and the changes in Miss Carter's classroom had blossomed into something extraordinary. For Daniel, it was a time of reflection. He had started the year feeling invisible, but now he stood taller, more confident, surrounded by peers who respected him. One spring morning, the principal announced an awards ceremony to celebrate student achievements. Among the honors was a special recognition for students who had shown remarkable growth, resilience, and leadership. To Daniel's astonishment, his name was called. As he walked to the stage, applause filled the room. A mix of pride and disbelief washed over him. Accepting the certificate, he glanced at the crowd and found his father's steady gaze. Samuel gave him a nod, the kind that spoke volumes without words. After the ceremony, Miss Carter approached him. "You earned this, Gray," he said, his tone firm but kind. "You've shown everyone what real strength looks like." "Thank you, sir," Daniel replied, his voice steady. "For everything." That evening, Daniel and Samuel sat on their porch, watching the sunset. The silence between them felt sacred. "You've come a long way," Samuel said finally. "Not just in school, but in how you see yourself." "I had good examples," Daniel replied with a smile. "You showed me what it means to stand tall." Samuel chuckled softly. "You did the hard work, Danny. I just reminded you of what was already there." In the days that followed, Daniel carried his father's lessons with him. Challenges became opportunities, and failures turned into stepping stones. His relationship with Ms. Carter evolved into mutual respect, the once intimidating teacher becoming an unexpected mentor. Years later, Daniel stood in front of his own classroom as a teacher. He often thought about the pivotal moments that had shaped him. He saw himself in the shy, uncertain students who avoided eye contact and made it his mission to lift them up. He understood the power of kindness and the strength of humility. One day, after a challenging class, Daniel sat at his desk, lost in thought. On the corner of his desk sat a photo of his father, Samuel Gray, taken during the Veterans Day Assembly. It was a reminder of the quiet strength that had guided him through his toughest times. As he packed up, a student approached him hesitantly. "Mr. Gray," she said, "thank you for not giving up on me." Daniel smiled, his heart swelling with pride. "You're stronger than you think," he replied, echoing his father's words. "Sometimes you just need someone to remind you." For Daniel, the journey had come full circle. The lessons of respect, humility, and resilience his father had taught him were now being passed to a new generation. With each student who found their strength, Samuel Gray's legacy lived on.